Hello everyone, tonight we step into a world lit by candle wax and dread, where the scent of lavender can't quite mask the tension thickening the air. You're in a room with too many eyes on you, and too many expectations pressing against your skin like a second corset. The wedding feast has ended, wooden plates licked clean of roast goose and cold stew guests, now drunk on mead and tradition, and now everyone is waiting for something else proof. Not of love, mind you, just blood. You probably won't survive this, not as the person you were anyway. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're still awake enough, comment where you're listening from and what time it is there. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The bed is made rough linen sheets, pulled taut goose feathers, fluff the ceremonial cloth folded neatly at the edge like an executioner's shroud. You don't know this man very well. Maybe you danced once stiffly. Maybe he smiled during the ring blessing. But now you're alone with him, and the room feels too quiet for something that's supposed to be holy. Outside the village snores, but inside this chamber you can hear the ticking of oil lamps, each flicker mocking your heartbeat. Your dress is complicated layers of wool and embroidered lace held together by strings that feel more like shackles tonight. He helps untie them awkwardly. His fingers shake a little, or maybe he's drunk. It doesn't really matter. Your body is an object now wrapped and unwrapped like a gift for a feast that isn't yours. There's a draft in the room, but it's not what's making your skin crawl. This isn't about pleasure, it's about reputation. Tomorrow morning someone will lift the sheet, maybe his mother, maybe your aunt, maybe the midwife who still smells of smoke and cloves, and they'll search for a stain that confirms you are a good girl. The absence of blood means you're a liar, or worse, already spoiled, even if you had no say, even if your first time was taken years ago by a stable boy or a nobleman's bored son. History rarely asked. The pressure to bleed isn't just superstition, it's policy. In ancient Mesopotamia, Babylonian marriage contracts could be annulled without that red mark. In medieval France, families might stage entire reenactments of consummation, complete with witnesses. Yes, actual witnesses. A room full of relatives clutching wine and fig tarts, all while pretending not to stare. Talk about romance. Some brides stuff slivers of liver or scrape their own thigh just to fake it. Historians still argue whether these rituals were as widespread as the records suggest or more symbolic than literal, but for many girls it was all too real. The moment of transition from daughter to wife wasn't celebrated with intimacy, it was stamped with scrutiny. In some communities, bells were rung the next morning to announce the deed had been done. If no bells rang, whispers started. Whispers were dangerous. Whispers turned into exile, or worse, into fire. You might be thinking surely the groom was nervous too. Maybe. But nervousness isn't the same as risk. He wasn't being judged on blood. He wasn't being told his entire worth hinged on a physical reaction his body had no control over. The man might be clumsy, might be gentle, might even be kind. But kindness doesn't undo the script. The sheet remains. So does the silence. Some cultures had even more theatrical approaches. In certain regions of Eastern Europe, villagers would parade the bloodied sheet through the streets like a flag of honour. Drums, dancing, ale flowing. Imagine your most intimate, awkward moment being the centre of a block party. All that for a stain that may or may not show up. All that because no one trusted your word alone. You sit on the edge of the bed. The fire crackles low. Your new husband fidgets with the hem of his sleeve, maybe trying to find the right words, maybe just waiting for the ritual to end. You stare at the embroidered canopy above roses leaves a dove. It's supposed to be symbolic. Peace, fertility, faith. But all you feel is a kind of hum inside your chest, something between fear and inevitability. Like when you know a thunderstorm is about to hit but there's nowhere to go. In ancient Greece, brides were sometimes passed through symbolic thresholds, carried over fires veiled under moonlight dressed in saffron-coloured robes to mark the death of their maidenhood. Some scholars believe these were meant to honour the transformation. Others see them as coded mourning rituals, a subtle nod to the life the bride had to leave behind. One fringe theory even suggests that in some tribal customs, the bride was kidnapped symbolically to distance her from her old identity. A theatrical abduction performed to shift loyalty from her father's home to her husband's bed. And what happens if you don't perform? What if the fear is too much, the pain too sharp, the mind too far gone? Then comes the whisper again, barren, frigid, disobedient. A wife who fails the first night may never recover socially. Some were sent back like defective goods. Others stayed, but with a stigma so loud it echoed through every meal and market day. And of course, if the man failed well, he was just tired or spirits didn't align. Still, even in this grim picture, some women found a spark of resilience. A whispered laugh under the sheets, a pact with the servant girl to swap cloths, a new husband who, though awkward, at least asked if you were cold. Those slivers mattered. They were the only parts of the night that belonged to you. You lie down now, the candles are almost gone. The shadow of the sheet folds over your knees, and somewhere below your bare feet curl like frightened mice. You are meant to become a wife tonight. But inside part of you is holding on to the girl you were this morning, the girl who played with her cousin's cat, who snuck one last apricot tart in the kitchen, who thought maybe this wouldn't be so bad. That girl will disappear soon, but not just yet. He was at the market once, standing near the barley sacks. That's the only memory you can summon him buying grain while you were scolded for touching plums. Now he's your husband. You know his name, his family's crest, and the scent of his breath after wine, but not his laugh or how he handles silence. And yet this union was stitched months ago, not with romance, but with signatures, and a shared understanding between fathers over muddy boots and steaming broth. You were there, but not present, like a goose being weighed, admired, then handed off. Marrying a stranger wasn't strange, it was structure. Across ancient cultures, love before marriage was a dangerous indulgence, a threat to inheritance, a poison to alliances. In ancient Rome, upper-class daughters were married off as young as 12, often to men chosen purely for political positioning. The girl's consent was irrelevant. The alignment of land holdings was not. In feudal Japan, samurai daughters became symbols of peace between rival clans, peace that might shatter if she refused to bow at the right moment. You sit across from him at the breakfast table and everything feels oddly formal. He thanks you for the bread like a merchant at a stall. You murmur a response, eyes on your cup, which is far too warm for how cold the room feels. His sleeves are embroidered, your mother would have whispered something judgmental about the thread. You imagine what she'd say now, but it's quiet in your head. Quieter than it was before the wedding, before the promise. Getting to know him was never part of the plan. Your lessons focused on pouring tea correctly, not deciphering a man's heart. He might be kind, or cruel, or dull, but that's beside the point. You were told your affection would bloom in time like mould or an unwanted houseplant, quiet, inevitable, and hard to remove. Historians still debate whether marriages were truly loveless, or simply structured differently from modern views of partnership. In many medieval European villages, a spouse was chosen based on livestock location and social standing, not shared values or emotional compatibility. Love was optional, and often seen as a luxury for poets or adulterers. One eccentric German noblewoman in the 13th century reportedly fell for her own stablemaster, but was promptly married off to a toothless cousin instead. Her letters preserved on parchment are scathing and oddly poetic. You try to remember his voice now. He spoke briefly at the altar, reciting vows he may not believe in to a God you only half understand. His voice was steady, formal, too rehearsed to reveal anything real. Since then, it's mostly been nods and past the salt. The depth of conversation hasn't gone beyond the colour of the sky. or how poorly the chickens are laying, and yet your bodies have already been offered to each other as if speech is the least necessary ingredient. In the Ottoman Empire, elite women were sometimes secluded before marriage, hidden behind lattice screens with grooms selected based on strategic military ties. The bride might not even hear her husband's voice until after the ceremony. A fringe account from a travelling French merchant described one wedding where the groom didn't speak to his wife for the first 3 months they communicated through gifts and notes slipped under the door. Somehow that feels more romantic than this breakfast table. Across many African and South Asian societies, arranged marriages prioritise kinship over chemistry. Elders negotiated, not teenagers. And there's wisdom in that. Perhaps after all, hormones aren't great financial advisors. But for you sitting here with a man whose favourite colour you don't even know? The idea of wisdom doesn't soothe the ache of unfamiliarity. Marriage was never meant to be a love story. It was an insurance policy, and you're the policy holder with no fine print. There's a moment after he leaves for the fields where you press your hand against the window pane staring out. It's not dramatic. It's just a habit now, watching him go like one watches rain. He walks with a slight limp. You hadn't noticed that before. Maybe he's kind to the workers. Maybe he isn't. You're left with questions that no one has taught you how to ask, let alone answer. You remember a friend, Marla, who once confessed that she prayed nightly for her husband's donkey to kick him. They barely knew each other before their wedding too, and now she lives in the next village, her face thinner every time you see her. Some say she burns her stew on purpose just to provoke something, anything that feels like connection. The fire in her hearth may be warmer than the one in her marriage bed. It's funny in a way, or it would be if it weren't also a bit terrifying. And yet there were exceptions. The baker's daughter who giggled with her husband at market, the midwife who called her man a goose-brained angel. Those stories were whispered like scandal or spells. Even the suggestion that two people might genuinely choose each other, might fall in love while still young, was a fairy tale with a bad reputation. It meant danger. It meant defiance. It meant a girl who might run off with the wrong boy, someone with charm but no land. You finger the edge of your sleeve now, folding it over and over. It's the same dress you wore yesterday. The fabric has softened where your elbows bend, like it's learning your body. Maybe your husband will learn you too, but you wouldn't bet your dowry on it. He returns home with dirt on his boots and another silence tucked under his tongue. You cook, he eats, you clear the plates, still no questions. There's a fringe theory floating among social historians that some ancient women developed private sign languages with their maids to express true feelings, simple gestures hidden in sewing routines or bread-kneading movements. The idea isn't proven, but it wouldn't surprise you. When spoken words are monitored or irrelevant, women find other ways. Maybe in time you'll find a way too. To laugh without offence, to cry without question, to exist without feeling like a permanent guest in your own story. The day winds down, another meal, another series of not-quite glances, and yet when he closes the door behind him tonight, there's a tiny moment where his hand lingers just a second longer than usual. Not passion, not affection, but pause. A pause that might grow into something, or not. But you notice it because you have nothing else yet to notice. The moment you're born, someone's already calculating your worth, except it's not about your laugh, your wit, or how you hum lullabies to yourself. It's livestock, it's coin weight, it's how many blankets and brass pots your father can scrape together before another family deigns to take you. Your dowry becomes your shadow trailing you before you even learn to walk. Too small and you're a burden. Too large and you're a walking prize, one that might never actually belong to herself. In ancient India, the dowry system was deeply entrenched, codified in Dharmashastra texts that dictated how much gold and grain should accompany a bride. And while it may have started as a form of security, it morphed quickly into a transaction with terrifying stakes. Girls with modest dowries were often discarded, abandoned, or forced into monastic life. Some became housemaids to their richer cousins, forever close to comfort, but never allowed to taste it. One 8th century poet wrote bitterly about watching his sister weep as her wedding was cancelled due to insufficient silver bowls, and so the scramble begins, your family selling heirlooms, bartering with relatives, or taking out ruinous loans just to make you more palatable. The neighbours whisper not unkindly but knowingly. They understand the stakes. They know that without enough coin or land or livestock, your suitors will vanish like mist. And when a match finally bites, it's not because of your embroidered gowns or pretty braids, it's because your father agreed to throw in a third cow. Historians still debate whether the dowry was originally intended as protection for women, or simply a way to redistribute wealth between households. Either way, it evolved into leverage, and leverage is only useful when someone's on the losing end, and that someone more often than not was the girl herself. In medieval Italy, families who couldn't afford dowries sometimes sent daughters to convents as an alternative, not out of piety but economics. You remember the panic in your mother's eyes when your cousin's dowry negotiations failed. She cried for days, not because of heartbreak, but because of disgrace. That cousin now spends her mornings sweeping temple floors and her evenings in a stone room with 3 other women who never married. The priests call it holy. She calls it quiet. There's a difference. Some girls became human interest stories sold for their dowries and then discarded once the money dried up. In a rare account from Tang Dynasty, China, a bride was returned to her family after 2 months her dowry kept as damages. Her father, unable to recover it, reportedly set fire to his own roof out of shame. The girl was never remarried. Her name vanished from the census roll shortly after. Even within the upper class, dowries created a ceiling on autonomy. A wealthy woman might have a grand wedding, but she'd still be watched her jewellery locked in family chests, her estate managed by men. In Byzantine tradition, dowries were catalogued like wartime spoils with formal inventories stamped and signed. A broken marriage often meant a legal battle for what had been gifted, as if her body and fortune could be separated. You once overheard your father negotiating your dowry like a merchant haggling over onions. She's modest, obedient. Good hands for spinning. The man across the table grunted, unimpressed. But is she quiet? He asked, as if silence was a more valuable currency than silver. Your father paused, then nodded, and you wondered just briefly if he believed it. In some parts of the world, dowries turned violent. The term dowry deaths refers to brides who are harassed, tortured, or even killed when their in-laws deem their dowry insufficient, an epidemic that still leaves scars today. In historical records from certain Mughal courts, dowry complaints became legal cases, though rarely in favour of the wife. A fringe story from 17th century Persia tells of a bride drowned in a cistern for arriving with one fewer chest than promised. The family claimed it was an accident. No one questioned it. Even in cultures where the dowry wasn't lethal, it was still limiting. It shaped how you were viewed before your personality ever entered the room. A rich dowry could land you a man with lands titles and several horses. A poor one meant you'd better be beautiful and preferably mute. Either way, you were measured by what came with you, not who came with you. One ancient tablet from Mesopotamia lists the contents of a dowry: 2 goats, 1 bronze mirror, 7 jars of oil, and a comb made of ivory. It reads like a shopping list, not a life. Some scholars romanticize these records, calling them reflections of practical affection. But when a woman's only insurance is how much soap she brought into the marriage, it's hard to see love in the ledger. You think now about your own dowry chest. Wooden, carved with a sun motif passed down through generations. Inside are linens you embroidered, copper pots polished so hard your fingers ached, and tiny charms meant to ward off childlessness. Each item a prayer, a bribe, a hope, all bundled up like a bundle of nerves. Sometimes you wonder what life would have been like without a dowry at all. Maybe you'd have married a farmer you liked. Maybe you wouldn't have married at all. Maybe you'd sell cheese in the square and sleep in a loft you called your own. But that world is a fantasy. Girls who dream without gold get silence in return. The irony, of course, is that even the best dowry doesn't guarantee safety. It's just a softer landing, a cushion before the fall. Because once the ceremony ends and the coin changes hands, you're no longer an asset. You're an investment and everyone expects returns. Especially your husband, especially his mother, especially the village that cheered your departure like a public debt finally paid. And so you carry that dowry like a ghost. It follows you through childbirth, through chores, through arguments about whether your daughter's veil should be red or white. It reminds you that your value was never just yours to define. And on the days you feel especially invisible, you think of those coins, those jars, those goats, all the things you never got to keep. There's a sheet drying on the line outside, fluttering in the morning breeze like a flag of someone else's triumph. But it's not just linen, it's evidence. Evidence that you bled, that you broke, that you played your role correctly in the performance called consummation. The neighbours walk past with slow, deliberate glances, pretending not to look while looking anyway. You watch them through the shutters, stomach a quiet knot. Because you know this isn't about privacy, it's about proof. And if the proof is missing, the consequences can be louder than any wedding bell. You might think it ends when the bedroom door closes, but for many brides across history, the most intimate moment became the most public. In certain medieval European villages, the bed sheets were displayed like trophies proudly paraded by female relatives, who inspected them as if testing fruit at a market. The blood stain became a seal of authenticity the woman's suffering converted into honour. Some families even invited village elders to witness the undressing, the lying down, the aftermath. Romance. Not really. It was quality control in lace trim. Historians still debate how often these public virginity tests actually occurred, or whether they've been exaggerated by literature and folklore. But scattered records and oral traditions suggest they weren't entirely mythical. In some Balkan and Middle Eastern communities, proof cloths were preserved for years like family heirlooms. One account from 18th century Albania describes a mother-in-law who embroidered the red mark with gold thread and framed it. The bride reportedly had fainted from the stress of the night and awoke to find her achievement hung above the hearth. The mechanics of the test were flawed at best, cruel at worst. Not all women bleed. Biology doesn't care about reputation. But tradition does, and tradition rarely listens to science. So when the stain doesn't show, panic sets in. Women have scraped their thighs with razors hidden cuts beneath garters smeared chicken blood on cloth, all to avoid the accusation that they weren't intact. You might have considered it too if your aunt hadn't warned you. They'll know if it's not real, she whispered the night before while braiding your hair too tightly. Don't make a fool of us. And just like that, your body wasn't yours anymore. It was a stage for other people's pride. A battlefield without weapons, only wounds. Even in ancient Egypt, virginity was tied to fertility rituals. Some families brought in midwives to certify purity before marriage, examining girls for an intact hymen as if checking for counterfeit currency. A fringe papyrus scroll even describes a ceremonial ointment applied the night before to ensure tightness and modest presentation. No word on whether it burned. Probably did. But pain in these rituals was often seen as a feature, not a flaw. Your mother said not to flinch. That's the key. No flinching, no crying, no hesitation. Because if you appear too afraid, they'll assume guilt. Smile and act like a queen, she advised, though. You noticed her lips trembling when she said it. Maybe she had her own sheet once. Maybe it didn't stain either, she never said. You remember the silence at breakfast, the glances, the way his mother kept her hands folded too tightly as if clutching invisible evidence. Your husband said nothing. He sipped from a chipped cup, eyes unfocused. The stain had been faint enough to raise questions, and questions in a house like this are almost always dangerous. In some parts of North Africa and Central Asia, unverified virginity was cause for annulment or worse. Honour killings, while not universal, have dotted the margins of many historical accounts. A bride brought shame by omission. and shame once ignited spreads faster than any fire. One story from rural Syria told of a woman whose father slit her veil with a dagger when the sheet remained white. She lived technically, but never spoke again. Some regions took a different route ritual hymen reconstruction. Ancient texts from India describe herbal compresses and drying agents used to restore tightness. More recent folk practices included vinegar soaks, thorny plant treatments, and even inserting leeches. Not exactly spa treatments. The goal wasn't comfort, it was camouflage. One fringe scholar argues that the obsession with virginity wasn't really about chastity, it was about property. A husband wanted to ensure that any child born of his wife came from his seed. Virginity was a warranty of paternity, not morality. That theory may seem cynical, but it does make the whole tradition of bloody bedsheets feel less about holiness and more about control. You wonder what would have happened if you had bled too much, if the pain had torn something inside instead of just proving something outside. There are stories, quiet ones, of brides who didn't survive their first nights. The wrong angle, the wrong man. No healing herbs, no midwife on call. Just a flickering candle and a family ready to praise a death if it meant honour. A girl in your cousin's village died that way years ago. Her name was Mara. She'd been quiet, pale, always chewing on her sleeves. The story goes that she was too small for the man they chose. The sheet was red, yes. But so were her eyes and the floor. They buried her in a dress she never wore in life, a bride and a warning. Even in communities where no blood test occurred, the expectation lingered. It shaped the way you walked, the way you breathed, the way you touched your own body in the dark. You were taught to fear yourself, to lock the doors of curiosity, because one slip could mean ruin. Not for the man, only for you. There's a knock on the door now. It's just the maid bringing tea. But your heart lurches anyway. You wonder if she knows, if she looked at the sheet and tilted her head. She sets the tray down, offers a small smile. For a moment you think she might say something, but she doesn't. No one does. And so the cloth dries. The whispers fade, but they never really disappear. They live in the walls, in the way his mother watches your hands, in the way the village girls giggle when you pass. The parade may have ended, but the scrutiny marches on, and you walk in step whether you like it or not. He has laugh lines, but you've never heard him laugh. His beard is peppered with grey, his fingers ringed with calluses, and gold one from labour, the other from status. He smells faintly of horse sweat and clove oil, the kind rubbed on sore joints. When he speaks, his voice doesn't rise or dip, it just lands flat and final like coins on a merchant's table. You sit across from him, legs too short for the bench back, too stiff in your new silk. You're 13, he's 47. It's not unusual. In many parts of the world it never was. Across medieval Europe, South Asia and the Islamic caliphates, girls were married as soon as they were of age, which often meant when they could bear children, not when they stopped clutching dolls. In contrast, their husbands were seasoned. Men who had already fought wars, buried first wives, outlived epidemics, and learned to like their meat salted and their women silent. Historians still debate the emotional dynamics of such pairings. Were older men more patient or more patronising? The answer, as always, depends on who's writing it. In your case, he doesn't seem cruel, just distant like a statue that occasionally hands you a slice of bread. He tells you how to stir the soup, how not to sit on the furniture too hard, how many figs to eat so you don't swell up. It's like living with a strict uncle, only you're expected to warm his bed. And the oddest part is how everyone acts like this is fine. Even your mother cried more on your 8th birthday than your wedding day. Some girls marry childhood friends. You married someone who says, "I remember the plague of '03 with nostalgia." There are creases in his hands where yours haven't even begun to form. When he touches your shoulder, it's with the careful detachment of a man inspecting livestock, not cruel, not affectionate, just verifying what he paid for. And in some ways that might be better than desire. In ancient Rome, aristocratic girls could be engaged before they had full teeth. Emperor Augustus once boasted of marrying his daughter off at 12 to secure a strategic alliance. In Ming Dynasty, China girls were married young to older men to stabilise land ownership. Love was considered a reckless luxury. One fringe record from the 16th century even details a dowry document for a bride aged 9. Mature for her age, it reads as if that makes it less disturbing. He talks about things you can't understand, land disputes, tax levies, the softness of wheat this year. You nod because you've learned that silence is safer than confusion. He chuckles at his own references, like the names of women he once knew. She had teeth like barley stalks, he says, grinning. You smile too, you have no idea what that means. But smiling is expected. There's a moment when you pass by the mirror still wearing your wedding jewellery. You look like a child who wandered into a play. The earrings pull too hard on your lobes. The bracelet slides off when you raise your arm. Nothing fits, not the silk, not the roll, not the man waiting for you in the next room, with a look that says, "Don't worry, I'll go slowly." Your body hasn't caught up with the ceremony. You still trip on long hems. Your hips are just beginning to soften and your voice still rises when you get excited. But now you're told to speak low. Walk slower. Never giggle. Because wives don't giggle. And certainly not with husbands old enough to be grandfathers. Some ancient cultures try to mitigate this. In the Talmudic tradition, it was advised that men marry women closer to their own age to avoid sorrow. But that was often ignored. Wealth, not wisdom, decided matches. In certain tribal regions of Africa, elders were prized as husbands for their wisdom and cattle. One fringe account from a British explorer tells of a girl married at 11 to a man in his 60s, gifted to him as repayment for a hunting debt. You watch him eat. He chews slowly, wiping his mouth with a cloth embroidered by someone long dead. His hands are broad fingers nicked from battles he never speaks of. You wonder what his first wife looked like, whether she was young too, whether she was afraid, whether she learned to love him or just learned to hide her flinches better than you. There's talk in the village of another bride like you. She walks with a limp now, the result of falling downstairs, though no one believes it. Her husband is 3 years older than yours. They say he talks to her like she's a servant, not a wife. But then again, few see a difference. He sometimes calls you little one, not unkindly, but it lands wrong, like a lullaby sung over a battlefield. You wonder if he sees you as a wife at all, or just something between nursemaid decoration and insurance policy. He places a hand on your back when guests visit, not affectionate, just possessive. A reminder that you are claimed. In quieter moments when he sleeps snoring in his chair, you notice how tired he looks. How heavy his limbs seem. Maybe he didn't want this either. Maybe he lost someone he loved and was pressured to remarry. Maybe you're both victims of a system that treats women as young as possible and men as old as possible, like it's some kind of efficiency model. Pair fertility with property. No room for joy. But even if he's gentle, you still feel trapped. Because gentleness doesn't erase age. It doesn't stop your body from flinching when he enters the room. It doesn't silence the part of you that still wants to climb trees and suck honey from the comb. You were a girl once. Now you are a bride. Soon you may be a mother. And at no point in this story were you asked. The lamp burns low. He coughs in his sleep, muttering something about a trade route. You curl beneath your blanket, too small for the bed, too old for your years. Outside, the night birds sing indifferent to the contract signed inside, and you wonder how long it will take before your reflection stops looking surprised. You were never really in the room, not when the decision was made. The bread was warm, the ale was sharp, and your father was in a particularly generous mood, because the neighbour's son had just inherited 3 oxen and a decent slice of land near the river bend. So they talked. Not about weather, not about politics. About you, quietly, like trading a fine cloak for a more useful coat. And just like that, you were promised. In some ways, it's impressive. Your body was leveraged to settle debts, unite farms, and reinforce alliances. 1 girl equals 4 goats, 2 pigs, and legal access to the East pasture. In ancient Mesopotamia, marriage contracts read like business ledgers, some even carved into clay tablets. Let it be known that the daughter of Asher has been given to Lugal in exchange for 40 units of barley and annual rights to water the orchard. No mention of her thoughts, just terms and conditions. Your father never raised his voice about it, why would he? This was normal. The best a man could do was place his daughter in a house with strong fences and thicker stew. Better a firm hand than an empty plate. He even patted your head that night like you'd done something noble, like being bartered away was a brave act. You remember the moment he told you. He stood at the doorway, shadowed by the lamplight, holding his cup like it was shielding him from guilt. "It's a good match," he said. "You'll eat well. He's not cruel." He looked proud. You looked at your shoes. You were 12. Historians still discuss whether these marriages were cruel inevitabilities or simply reflections of pragmatic living. In economies where land meant survival, daughters were transactional anchors. In medieval Europe, aristocratic women were chess pieces sent to marry dukes, barons, even enemies just to stop bloodshed or gain an ally. One fringe letter from a Venetian merchant describes offering his 3 daughters to 3 rival families in a single season, calling it his triple insurance plan. There was no question of waiting for love. Love, you were told, came after marriage, if at all. It might grow like moss on the side of a stone wall. Or it might never come, and that would just have to be enough. Because girls like you didn't marry for joy. You married to ensure that grain shipments weren't blocked by petty border feuds. In ancient Japan, samurai families used marriage to absorb weaker clans. Sometimes a girl would be betrothed to a man she'd never meet, only to be swapped for someone else last minute, if a better deal emerged. Warrior wives, they were called, though they often never touched a sword. Their battlefield was the dinner table, their victory silence and obedience. And even among commoners, marriage was about keeping peace. 2 feuding families might use a bride to seal the breach. If she succeeded, she was praised as a peacemaker. If the feud reignited, she was blamed for not trying hard enough. You once knew a girl named Layla, whose marriage was supposed to end a land dispute. The families fought anyway. She died in childbirth, and both sides claimed her ghost haunted the barley fields in protest. Your dowry chest was packed with care, but your emotions were not. No one asked if you liked the boy, if you feared him, if you'd ever spoken longer than 3 words to him in your life. You were an offering wrapped in lace and sealed with a nervous smile. The deal had been signed before you ever learned how to spell his name. There's something surreal about being the prize in a game you didn't play. The way people smile at you at market now like you're a polished coin finally spent. The baker slips you an extra roll, the blacksmith nods a little deeper. The older women clasp your hands like you've graduated into some noble, necessary suffering, and you nod too, because nodding is all that's left. In Ottoman court circles, brides were often selected based on how well their unions could bind political tensions. A sultan's daughter might be married off to a regional governor with questionable loyalties, not for love, not even for status, but for strategy. The girl, regardless of her age or desires, became a diplomatic tether. Her success was judged by how still the waters remained in her wake. One fringe account from 10th century Persia mentions a bride chosen to settle a water rights dispute between 2 mountain villages. The contract included a clause requiring her to deliver a child within 1 year, or the land rights would revert. No one recorded what happened to her, just whether the water flowed, and sometimes the bargain failed. A marriage arranged in goodwill might sour in silence, or rage, or frost, but once sealed it was not easily undone. Divorce was rare, scandalous, and dangerous for you, not for him. If he tired of you, he could send you to the garden, the guest room, or the farthest end of the house. You'd still be his wife, just not his companion. You still wonder if your father hesitated, even for a second. If he ever looked at you and thought she's too small, too young, too full of sunlight. If he ever wished he could wait just a year longer. But the field needed tending. The harvest was uncertain. and your body was the only stable investment left. Sometimes at night you stare at the ceiling beams and try to find meaning in the knots and grains of the wood. You imagine their roads maps escape routes, but they always curve back toward the hearth, toward duty, toward the contract, because this is your home now, not chosen, just signed. The vows were short, sacred they said, spoken in front of a priest, a scribe, or in some cases just a witness with decent handwriting. To honour and obey you recited your mouth dry, the words sticking like honey turned bitter. But what you didn't know, what no one tells girls wrapped in veils and too tight shoes, is that these vows are less about love and more about locks. The moment you spoke them, your freedom didn't just drift away, it was documented. In many ancient and medieval societies, marriage wasn't just a ceremony, it was a legal transformation. You were no longer a daughter, a girl, or even a person with agency. You became a wife, a status that carried more limitations than titles. In ancient Roman law, the concept of manus meant that a woman passed from her father's control directly into her husband's, like property changing hands. The transaction just happened to come with flowers, and once you entered the legal shadow of your husband, the world saw you differently. In the eyes of the law, you couldn't own land. You couldn't testify in court without a male proxy. You couldn't keep your own wages if you even had any to begin with. Your name might still be yours, but your choices weren't. Even your silence could be dictated. Historians still debate whether these laws were enforced universally, or varied significantly by region and class. In rural areas, women sometimes managed estates when their husbands were away. But legality and practicality don't always match. A peasant wife might till the field and pay the tax, but if her husband came home and said no, then it was no. One fringe record from 14th century Germany tells of a woman who tried to buy her own spinning wheel. Her husband had it burned for insubordination. You'd think that religion might offer some kind of mercy. It depends. In many Christian traditions, marriage was deemed indissoluble. What God has joined together, let no man put asunder, except if the man was bored, or wanted to chase a prettier dowry, or just found a loophole. Divorce was practically forbidden for women unless they were saints or scandalous, and even in cultures where divorce was permitted, it was rarely equitable. In medieval Islamic law, men could initiate divorce by pronouncing talaq, essentially, I divorce you 3 times. Women, however, had to go through complex legal appeals and provide substantial evidence of mistreatment, often requiring male witnesses. Try gathering that when your bruises fade quickly and your cries are dismissed as dramatic. You remember hearing a neighbour talk once. Her cousin tried to leave her husband. She petitioned the village council, said he was cruel, cold and drunk half the time. They listened, nodded, then told her to go home and pray harder, because sometimes legal shackles come wrapped in prayer beads and pity. In certain cultures, women were tied to their husbands even after death. The ancient Indian practice of sati, where widows were burned alive on their husbands' funeral pyres, was the most brutal expression of this. While not as widespread as once believed, it was still real and still terrifying. One fringe account tells of a widow who tried to run from the pyre and was forced back by her own relatives. They said it was honour. She said nothing. Her throat had already closed from the smoke. You stare at your marriage contract kept folded neatly in a cedar box smelling faintly of old ink and rosemary. It lists your dowry, your husband's promises, and a clause about inheritance that you don't fully understand. There is no section for happiness, no paragraph about consent, just obligations yours mostly, bound in parchment and sealed with wax, and yet you signed. Or at least someone did on your behalf. Maybe your father, maybe the village scribe. Your signature, if present at all, is a shaky mark more ritual than choice. But now it binds you, not just to the man, but to the role. Even laughter must be measured. Too much joy and you're accused of frivolity. Too little and you're ungrateful. The sacred vow is a shape you must now fit into, even when your body aches and your voice feels too big for it. A wife must not complain. A wife must not question. A wife must endure. One fringe document from the 12th century Byzantine Empire outlines a case where a woman attempted to annul her marriage after 5 years of emotional exile. Her husband ignored her, insulted her lineage, and moved into another home with a mistress. She pleaded before a religious tribunal citing neglect and humiliation. The verdict: pray for his heart to soften, remain faithful, case closed. You think sometimes about walking, just leaving. Not far, just out the gate down the road through the forest. But where would you go? The law doesn't recognise wandering wives. You'd be labelled a deserter, a vagabond, perhaps even a thief for stealing your own self away. There are rumours of women who escaped. One fled to a convent and lived the rest of her life copying manuscripts in Latin she never understood. Another disguised herself as a man and joined a merchant caravan until someone discovered her hair growing out beneath her cap. She was sent back quietly, and no one saw her again. The vows still echo in your mind sometimes, not as poetry, but as punctuation. Obey, serve, submit. They roll around your head like stones in a jar, not because you believe them, but because repetition can wear grooves in the mind, just like shackles wear grooves in the skin. And so you kneel by the hearth, folding linen and waiting for nothing in particular. He's out maybe tending the field, maybe drinking, maybe somewhere better. But you're here with your sacred vow stitched invisible across your collarbone. Legal, sacred, inescapable. The kind of promise that keeps you in place even after your heart has wandered far, far away. There's a rhythm to the silence that settles over the bedroom. Not peace, something heavier. A kind of held breath that lasts all night. The bed creaks once, then doesn't move again for a long time. You lie still, watching the ceiling, wondering if he's waiting for you to speak, or if he prefers it this way, wordless, motionless transaction complete. No one prepared you for how quiet this would be. They taught you how to curtsy, how to pour wine, how to fold letters you can't even read. But no one taught you what to do when his hands are on your hips and your voice is nowhere to be found. You don't even know if it's supposed to feel good. All you know is that you're supposed to accept, to nod, to stay still, and to never mention pain unless it's on behalf of someone else. In many historical records, female pleasure is absent, entirely vanished like breath on cold glass. Ancient Greek philosophers wrote volumes on desire but rarely bothered to include the woman's experience. In medieval manuals on marital duties, sex was framed as a task essential for reproduction, preferably quick, and ideally quiet. Some texts advised husbands to avoid frightening the wife with too much force, as if she were a startled goat. Comfort was optional, consent practically a myth. Historians still argue whether women were truly this silenced, or whether their voices were simply erased by male scribes. The answer, of course, is both. One fringe diary from a 15th century Polish midwife records her patients whispering fears, and confessions into her apron folds about bruises bleeding and nights spent crying into the mattress. None of it made it into the official record, but it existed. In the gaps, you've learned to listen to the silence. It speaks in the rustle of sheets, in the way he turns his back without a word in the pause before he reaches for you. You've learned that touch can be colder than distance, that intimacy without tenderness feels like theft, that when you flinch you must do it quietly. The first time was nothing like the songs. No trembling glances, no aching anticipation. Just a man fulfilling his right and a girl trying not to disappoint. The candlelight flickered against the wall, and you stared at it, counting the seconds like a prisoner. When it was over, he patted your thigh, rolled away and fell asleep. You lay there with a hollow between your ribs wider than the space between your bodies. In ancient Hindu traditions, a wife was expected to satisfy her husband's needs as a sacred duty. Some scriptures advised her to never deny him, unless in blood or illness. One particularly harsh text stated that if a wife refused her husband even once, She could be cursed in her next life to be barren. Heaviness disguised as holiness. The kind of commandment that settles in your spine and stays. You once tried to ask him if he loved his first wife. He blinked, then said she didn't complain much. That was the standard. Not joy, not laughter, just silent compliance. He smiled then faintly, as if remembering a well-behaved hound. You find small excuses now. A sore stomach, a prayer vigil, helping the neighbour's birth. But eventually the excuses run thin. You're told a good wife doesn't refuse. A good wife doesn't argue. A good wife understands his needs. But no one seems concerned about yours. Even in societies that honoured goddesses of fertility and love, the everyday woman's experience was very different. Ancient Sumerian hymns sang of Inanna's sensuality. Yet Sumerian wives were expected to remain chaste and docile outside of ceremonial duties. In Japan's Heian period, noble women wrote erotic poetry in private while publicly donning layers of silken decorum. The double standard stitched into silken scripture. There's a difference between enduring and agreeing. You've learned to blur that line to survive. Smile when he touches your cheek. Nod when he whispers your name in the dark, though it sounds like he's trying to remember which one you are. Moan softly, not out of pleasure, but because silence makes it worse sometimes. It stretches the room until your body feels like part of the furniture. There's talk of a woman in a neighbouring village who refused to share her bed after her third miscarriage. She lived in the attic for a year, they say. Her husband threatened to send her back to her father. Her father said she was lucky to still have a roof. Eventually she returned to the marital bed. No one asked what changed her mind. Maybe it was hunger. Maybe it was fear. Maybe it was knowing that refusal wasn't truly a choice. One fringe medical text from the 12th century claimed that if a woman didn't find pleasure in intercourse, she was spiritually closed and should fast for 3 days to realign her body. As if starvation was the solution to discomfort. As if pain was her fault for not welcoming it with open arms. You sometimes wonder if he notices the tears you wipe away before turning to sleep. If he recognises that your lips only part for prayers now. But he never asks. Perhaps he prefers it this way. A wife who says nothing is a wife who stays. And yet in the quietest moments you remember stories of women who left, who escaped into forests disguised as men, who became midwives, herbalists, or even witches depending on who tells the tale. Women who chose silence not because they were broken, but because they were waiting for the right moment to roar. But you're not there yet. You're still here in this room, on this bed, lying beside a man who doesn't mean harm but also doesn't see you. You're still pretending that sex is something you give, not something taken. You're still pretending that your body belongs here. Eventually you might forget it ever belonged to you. The first time you feel the nausea, it's early. Before the sun, before the roosters. Just a quiet lurch in your stomach that you almost ignore until it happens again the next morning. And again. And by the 4th day your mother-in-law has already noticed. She doesn't ask. She simply sets a bowl of boiled mint beside your bed and begins knitting tiny socks with a knowing nod. The house is already preparing as if your body signed the contract before you did. There is no celebration, not yet, only watchfulness. You're treated less like a woman now, more like a vessel. Don't lift that. Don't eat this. Don't laugh too hard or sit too long or let your hands go cold. You are fragile cargo in your own skin. Your husband seems proud but distant, like a farmer admiring sprouting wheat from the porch. He has done his part. The rest is your burden. Pregnancy, they say, is a woman's glory. But historically it was often her gravest risk. In many ancient and medieval societies, childbirth was the most common cause of death for women under 30. No anaesthesia, no sterilisation, no trained surgeons, just blood, sweat, prayers, and maybe a midwife with steady hands. Historians still argue whether birth was treated as a miracle or a sentence. From the way they whisper when another woman dies, it sounds like both. You remember the story of your aunt who bled out during her 3rd delivery. They buried her in a white shift, her baby in her arms, both wrapped in the same cloth. No marker, just a small pile of stones by the edge of the orchard. She was obedient, they said, as if that made it less tragic. In ancient Greece, the goddess Artemis presided over both virginity and childbirth, a bitter pairing if you think about it. Young girls prayed to her to survive their first union. Grown women prayed to her to survive its consequence. A fringe account from a Roman midwife's scroll described a ritual of tying red wool around a woman's thigh to ward off evil spirits during labour. Some women tied it tighter around their own wrists to remember what was still theirs. Your feet swell. Your appetite shrinks. You wake at odd hours, sweating, unsure if it's the baby turning or your thoughts. The midwife checks you once a week, pokes at your belly, nods wisely, and tells you not to worry. But worry is stitched into every step you take. You've seen too many women vanish behind the birthing curtain and never return. There's no hospital, no clean white sheets, just straw on the floor and vinegar in a bowl. When the time comes, you'll squat or kneel or collapse, whatever your body allows, and everyone will hover not with support but with expectation. You must produce, you must survive, but not both. That would be asking too much. You dream of twins, of a child with your nose, of one with his silence. You dream of bleeding and wake with your hands clenched around the sheets. Your mother-in-law says it's normal. That dreams are just shadows of the womb. But you're not so sure. Some shadows don't wait for sleep. In medieval England, it was common to write a birthing prayer weeks before labour, a last will disguised as devotion. Women confessed, forgave, and instructed their midwives whom to give their combs and rings to should they not wake up. In Islamic traditions, a woman in labour was granted the status of a martyr if she died giving birth, a small honour for such a high wager. One fringe tale from rural France tells of a girl who carved her initials into a wooden spoon, hoping it would be passed down if she didn't live to see her child grow teeth. You try not to think of pain, but it finds you anyway. In your back, your ribs, the backs of your knees, you begin to understand that your body isn't breaking, it's opening. But there's a kind of breaking in that too, like the cracking of a walnut to get to the sweet centre. Except you're not sure if the centre is sweet, or if it's even yours to taste. Your husband becomes more attentive in his way. He brings warm milk, brushes your hair without pulling. But he never asks how you feel. Maybe he thinks it's not his place, or maybe he doesn't want to know. He touches your belly as if checking the weight of a melon. Soon he says, as if that word isn't a cliff edge. The midwife returns with herbs, bitter ones. She shows you how to breathe, how to scream into a cloth so the neighbours don't gossip. She's done this 12 times, lost 5 mothers, 2 babies, 1 both. She carries those numbers in her eyes and they weigh heavier than her apron. You hear whispers outside the door. The mother-in-law, the cook, the neighbour, they're making plans, washing linens, preparing the cradle, preparing the grave clothes too, just in case, because they've learned not to expect only one outcome. Birth and death walk together after all. 2 guests arriving at the same hour, and then when it finally happens, it comes like a flood. Pain that blanks the world, hands on your legs, heat on your forehead, a tearing, a scream. Or maybe that was someone else. Maybe that was you. It ends only when the room quiets, when the baby cries, when you don't. They say you were lucky. You lived. The baby lived. The sheets were soaked, but the midwife was quick. They give you broth, whisper blessings, tell you how strong you are. But you don't feel strong. You feel scraped out, hollowed, floating just behind your own body like a guest at your own return. You lie in bed, bleeding still like a slow leak. The cradle is beside you, and in it something small and alive. You want to smile. You want to feel the joy they said would come. But all you feel is the weight of having survived what many don't. Birthing or buried, those were the options. And you're still here, still aching, still wondering if you're truly on the winning side. She doesn't knock. She just enters like wind through a cracked shutter, cold and inevitable. Her presence changes the air in the room, thins, it makes it harder to breathe without apology. She doesn't raise her voice, doesn't need to. Every gesture is an inspection. Every glance is a verdict. You're not a wife in her eyes, you're a stranger occupying her son's bed. They never said marriage came with a second authority figure. You were ready for one man, not two. Not this woman whose hands have rubbed every corner of the house smooth with expectation. She ran this home before you arrived and still does now. You were supposed to bring freshness, a new chapter, but to her you're a smudge on a clean page. In many traditional societies, the mother-in-law ruled the household even more than the husband. In parts of rural China and India, newlywed brides lived under the command of the husband's mother, who determined everything from meal portions to bedtime routines. Historians still argue whether this hierarchy was a survival mechanism in multi-generational homes or simply an inherited cruelty. Either way, you're caught in it. Between one man's silence and one woman's authority, she corrects your stitching, redoes your soup, moves your laundry off the line and rehangs it her way. Nothing is outright cruel, but everything drips with disapproval. That's not how we do it here, she says, even when she means that's not how you should do it. Her voice is honey over nails, and you nod, always nodding even when your teeth are clenched tight behind a smile. One fringe account from a 17th century Hungarian diary describes a bride who was not allowed to sit at the dining table until her mother-in-law gave birth to her own final child. Until then, the younger woman ate in the hallway kneeling. The idea of generational dominance wasn't just tradition, it was protocol. You could live under the same roof for decades and still never earn a seat. You share a kitchen but not recipes. You share a house but not a home. When you misplace a ladle or let the lentils burn, it isn't seen as an accident, it's seen as incompetence. Or worse, rebellion. She never says these words directly. She doesn't need to. The way she sighs while sweeping behind you is enough. The baby cries, and she's faster than you. Picks him up like she's reclaiming what was never fully yours. You were asleep, she says, not unkindly. But what you hear is, you were unfit. She holds him like a prize, like a second chance, and you still healing, still learning, are expected to thank her for it. In ancient Jewish households, the mother-in-law had specific duties to oversee the young wife's behaviour. She was the guardian of family reputation, the enforcer of modesty, the watcher at the gate. Some records describe bridal probation periods lasting up to a year. A trial run of your worthiness, you feel like you're still in it. She controls the stories in this house. When guests visit, she tells them how much the baby looks like her side, how you dropped a plate the first week, how you still don't salt the soup enough. These are not criticisms, they're anecdotes shared with a smile that never reaches you. Laughter at your expense is one of the few things that brings warmth to this cold hearth. Sometimes you try to connect. You ask about her youth, her wedding, her own mother-in-law. Her eyes narrow slightly, then soften. We didn't speak unless spoken to, she says, and just like that, the door you thought you were opening slams shut again. A fringe belief from 12th century Northern Europe held that the mother-in-law's behaviour in this life would determine her rank in the afterlife, whether she'd sit beside her ancestors or be made to carry pots forever in purgatory. No one believed it fully, but it was whispered by daughters-in-law behind bread ovens and garden hedges. A private hope, a quiet curse. You once dreamt of a family, not just a marriage, of a home with shared laughter and hands reaching to help, not hover. But this feels more like a test, and the rules change daily. One day your embroidery's coming along, the next it's sloppy and rushed. You try to please her, but you're always one stitch behind. Your husband rarely intervenes. He shrugs, says she's just like that. As if that explains everything. As if surviving a sharp tongue and endless oversight is just another rite of passage. But he never truly sees what happens when he's not around. The cold plates. The unfinished chores that mysteriously become yours. The bruised ego you wrap at night under layers of patience. There's another woman in the village who refused to live with her mother-in-law. She demanded a separate home. People still talk about her like she was a wolf in a wedding dress, bold, unruly, dangerous. But she smiles when she walks to the well and her children don't flinch at shadows. You wonder what it's like to have space where your breath doesn't feel borrowed. And still, there are rare moments. Like when the baby laughs and she lets her guard drop. Or when you bring in herbs she needed and she forgets to correct your posture. You wonder if buried beneath years of expectations there's a tired woman who once wanted gentleness too. Maybe this prison wasn't built by her, maybe she just made the best room in it. You breathe in long and slow. The child stirs in his cradle. The fire burns low. She's knitting again, rocking slightly, her face expressionless in the amber light. You stir the soup careful this time. Not because you fear her, but because you're learning that surviving her may take more than endurance. It might take understanding the bars of the cage better than she ever did. You stare into the warped bronze mirror, its surface too dull to flatter, but sharp enough to criticize. Your reflection is thin, pale, smudged with fatigue, and still somehow not quite right. The mother-in-law clicks her tongue behind you, not unkindly, just pointedly. You'll need more rouge, and starch those sleeves tighter next time. He shouldn't see you looking tired. You nod because you've learned that beauty is a task, not a trait. They say women are like flowers meant to bloom quietly, obediently, and beautifully. But flowers aren't bandaged, painted, pinched, or boiled alive. You've seen what it takes to be beautiful here. Red cheeks, even if they're from slapped skin. Tiny feet, even if they were broken to get that way. A waist so small you wheeze when laughing. Suffering has somehow become a form of elegance. In ancient China, foot binding began when girls were 5 or 6. The arch was crushed, the toes curled under bones softened with water, then broken under silk wraps. A lotus foot was no bigger than 3 inches. Men wrote poems about it. Women wept quietly at night, hiding their scars beneath embroidered slippers. Historians still debate whether it began as imperial fetish or class marker, but either way, girls limp their way into desirability. You thank your stars that you were spared that particular cruelty, but others take its place. Corsets so tight they bruise your ribs, lead-based powder that stings your cheeks and steals your breath, a sash drawn across your chest to flatten what has barely begun to grow. They say modesty is beauty, but modesty, it turns out, is measured in how uncomfortable you can remain without complaint. A fringe beauty guide from 16th century France suggested applying crushed pearl mixed with vinegar to the skin for a radiant glow. The result, rashes, infections, and occasional blindness if it reached the eyes. But looking pale meant you weren't labouring outside, which meant status, which meant marriage, which meant survival. So women blinded themselves for the chance to be chosen. You once overheard a merchant's wife saying, "A pretty girl is half married already." You were 9. You didn't know yet that this meant looking a certain way, not just being pleasant. It didn't matter if you could sew or sing or remember the saints' names. If your skin was too dark, your teeth too wide, your fingers too stubby, you were unfortunate. And unfortunate girls stayed unmarried, or married poorly, which might be worse. Your mother plucked your eyebrows for the first time while you cried, not because of the pain, though, that was sharp enough, but because of the look in her eyes. Not pride, not cruelty, just fear. Fear that if you weren't beautiful enough, you'd be left behind, that you'd become her worn, overlooked, always chasing favour. In ancient Egypt, elite women shaved their entire bodies, wore heavy coal eyeliner, and used perfumes made of myrrh and goose fat. Queens were embalmed with more care than some men were crowned. But even beauty didn't save them. Cleopatra, famed for her looks, still had to use her mind and manipulation to survive in a world of powerful men. Beauty opened doors, but it didn't guarantee safety once you walked through them. Your husband comments on your looks sometimes, not romantically, more like assessing a piece of fruit at the market. "You looked tired this morning. That colour makes your face look longer. Don't gain more weight with the next child." You nod. Again. Because disagreement isn't ladylike. And ladylike is the currency you trade in now. You try to make sense of the rules. Hair must be long but never wild. Lips red but not too red. Hips full but not vulgar. Skin soft but not sun-darkened. You're to be natural but only artificially. A walking contradiction shaped by paint pins and shame. One fringe recipe from a medieval English manuscript recommends applying boiled pigeon droppings to the face to clear blemishes. Another from ancient Rome involved mixing crushed snails and honey as a rejuvenating mask. You haven't tried either. But you understand the desperation behind them. When your value is written on your skin, you'll do anything to keep the ink from fading. And then there's the envy. Quiet, corrosive. You catch it in other women's eyes and sometimes in your own. A younger girl with softer hands, a new bride with better posture. You watch the way your husband's gaze lingers not long but just enough to feel it. You add more rouge that night, tie your sash tighter, cry a little less. Beauty becomes a game with no finish line. You keep adjusting, refining, chasing a standard that shifts with every season, every age, every houseguest's comment. Your back aches from posture, your cheeks sting from scrubbing, and still it's never quite enough. Not flawless, not fresh, not better than what he's seen or imagined. Even your child isn't immune. Already your mother-in-law critiques his nose's ears. Too much of your side, she says with a twitch of her lips. You wonder if she means you or your mother, or perhaps she's warning you, make the next one prettier, or try harder. You look in the mirror again before bed, trace the outline of your lips, retie your braid. You wonder if there's a version of you somewhere untouched by all this running barefoot across grass with wild hair and unpainted skin. But that girl wouldn't survive long here. She wouldn't last through a single breakfast. So you smile. You always smile. Beauty, after all, is easier to maintain when people can't see the cracks beneath it. The candles flicker low. The room softens. You whisper goodnight to the woman in the mirror. She doesn't respond. He comes home late again, smelling faintly of wine ash and something floral that doesn't belong in your laundry room. His boots are dusty, his sleeves crooked, and his lips a little too red for someone who claims he's been at the grain store. You ask no questions, of course, because asking would be ungracious, and grace in this marriage is your only shield. You set out the evening stew without comment. He eats, sighs, stretches, and mutters something about long negotiations. He doesn't lie with conviction, but he doesn't need to. The script protects him. The role of the husband comes with benefits like unchallenged freedom and the assumption that a man has needs. Your needs, however, are never mentioned. In most traditional societies, male infidelity was tolerated, even expected. Ancient Greek men could visit hetero-educated courtesans without social consequence, while their wives stayed cloistered at home, weaving and watching the oil lamps burn. In feudal Japan, samurai were permitted multiple lovers, even concubines, as long as their public face remained intact. Historians still debate whether this was rooted in biology status or plain male privilege, but there's no real mystery. The rules were simply written in favour of the one holding the pen. Your role is clear: be loyal even if abandoned. Be patient even if mocked. When the whispers reach you that he's been seen with a widow near the fish market, you swallow them like spoiled milk. They curdle in your stomach, but you smile anyway. Because to show anger would be worse than being betrayed. It would be unfeminine. There's a story from your cousin's village about a girl named Rena, who caught her husband with a servant. She screamed. Just once. And that was enough. He hit her hard enough to knock out 2 teeth. When she ran to the magistrate, they asked what she'd done to provoke him. She returned home with stitched lips and no answers. You remember the warnings: before your wedding men will wander. Don't be the kind of wife they run farther from. It was meant as advice. But it felt like surrender. An agreement that if he ever strayed, it would somehow be your fault. Your faded youth, your stretched belly, your silence stretched too thin. In ancient Mesopotamia, a man could accuse his wife of adultery and have her drowned, proof optional. If she wanted to accuse him, however, she needed witnesses' testimony and the bravery of a fool. One fringe clay tablet even details a husband confessing to 3 mistresses, yet he remained an honoured merchant. His wife, meanwhile, was exiled for neglecting the hearth. There's no punishment for him, even if he's caught. He shrugs. Men drink. Men have appetites. Boys will be boys, even when they're grown men with grey in their beards and keys to someone else's door. You thought you'd be ruined. One glance too long, one letter misunderstood, and suddenly you're a seductress, a traitor, a disgrace. You've seen it happen. A widow smiled too brightly at a soldier passing through. The next day her name was ash in every mouth. She lost work, she lost protection, she lost the benefit of the doubt, all for a smile. Meanwhile the soldier boasted over drinks and earned a second helping of stew. In Renaissance Italy, a woman accused of infidelity could be locked in a room for years, hidden away until her family decided what to do with her. Some never came out. Others were married off quickly, like broken furniture sold at a discount. A fringe account describes a noblewoman whose own brother challenged her alleged lover to a duel and killed him while she was sent to a convent for her own good. You've stopped waiting for him at night, stopped asking where he's been. It changes nothing, and you've learned that knowing just makes the hurt sharper. Instead, you focus on the child, on the way he laughs when you tickle his toes, on the way he clings to your sleeve like you're a lighthouse. He doesn't understand betrayal, not yet. Sometimes your husband kisses your cheek before bed, smelling faintly of another. Sometimes he doesn't touch you at all. When he does, it's quick, efficient, like fulfilling a chore. And you lie still thinking of the girl you used to be, the one who believed being chosen meant being cherished. They say men stray because they're hungry, as if love is a kitchen and you're a forgetful cook, as if affection has a schedule you missed. No one asks if you are hungry, if you crave laughter, softness, being seen. Because women are expected to fast their whole lives and still smile at the feast. One ancient Egyptian scroll contains a love poem written by a woman for a man who never returned her affections. Her verses are soft aching, unconsummated. She writes of waiting by the reeds, of watching the water for signs of his return. Scholars found it touching, but you find it familiar, waiting for someone who doesn't wait for you. You hear the market gossip sometimes, of noblemen with secret children, of priests with soft eyes for pretty boys, of husbands with 2 households and 2 sets of lies. Everyone knows, but no one says, because power protects, and silence buys peace, or at least the illusion of it. You've thought of running, of finding someone who looks at you and sees you, but then you think of the child, the roof, the stew bubbling in the hearth. Love, you realise, is not always worth the price of shelter, and so you stay, not out of weakness, out of calculation. You light the candle on your side of the bed, watch it flicker, wonder if the perfume on his collar will be gone by morning, if the scent will blend with yours, if he'll notice the way you braid your hair differently now. He doesn't, and still you braid it again tomorrow. The bread didn't rise this morning. The cow gave sour milk. Your husband tripped on the threshold and the baby cried without stopping for breath. And somehow, by mid-afternoon, the neighbours are eyeing you like you spat in the baptismal font. You didn't do anything, but that's the problem, isn't it? When you're a wife, silence can be suspicious, grief can be ominous, and God forbid you own a cat. It starts with whispers, the kind that linger behind market stalls and travel faster than wind over fields. She talks to herself, they say. Her herbs grow too fast, her child never had a fever. And wasn't her grandmother a little strange too? The things you've done right, healing, feeding, surviving, suddenly become threats. Talents turn to signs, strength turns to sorcery. In parts of early modern Europe, being too quiet, too clever, or too unlucky could land you in the fire. The infamous Malleus Maleficarum, the hammer of witches, warned that women, especially wives, were more susceptible to demonic influence because of their insatiable, carnal desires and weak minds. Historians still argue whether this was a genuine fear or an excuse to punish inconvenient women. Either way, it worked. Thousands of women were tortured, drowned, or burned, many of them married, many of them simply too different. You always knew the line between wife and witch was thinner than the skin on a baked apple. One day you're scrubbing pots, the next you're being accused of cursing them. You offer your neighbour garlic tea for her cough, and suddenly you're muttering spells. You stay inside too long during a storm, and they wonder if you summoned it. And if the child dies any child anywhere well, you must have glanced too long at the mother. A fringe case from a German town tells of a baker's wife accused because her bread loaves always rose evenly. They said it wasn't natural. They said the yeast must have been enchanted. The woman was arrested, questioned under mild pressure, a phrase that meant dislocated thumbs, and released only when the town priest fell ill from her absence and demanded her return. Not because she was innocent, but because she made excellent rye. Your husband doesn't defend you. He doesn't accuse you either. He just tightens his jaw, avoids eye contact, and leaves for the fields earlier than usual. Maybe he believes the rumours. Maybe he doesn't care. Maybe it's safer for him to pretend not to hear. Men, after all, are rarely burned unless they speak too loudly on a woman's behalf. Even the child senses it. He clings to your leg more than before, cries when strangers pass the fence. You hold him close, breathing in his scent like a charm against the gathering storm. Because sometimes the only shield you have left is love, and even that can be turned against you. She bewitched the child, they might say. He's too attached. In parts of colonial New England, women were hanged for possessing poppets, dolls, stuffed with herbs and pins, often used for healing. In Scotland, a wife was accused because her butter didn't spoil during a summer heatwave. She was bound and dunked in the river, her hands tied to her knees. They called it trial by water. If she floated, she was guilty. If she sank, she was innocent and drowned. You catch your reflection in the kettle. Tired eyes, a frayed braid, smudges of ash on your cheek from cleaning the hearth. You don't look like a witch, but you also don't look like what they want: cheerful, pliant, forgettable. That's the real offence. You are supposed to fade, not sharpen. You are supposed to endure, not outlast. A fringe pamphlet from 17th century France lists suspicious traits in wives, among them reading singing alone and smiling without being spoken to. 3 things you did just this morning. Congratulations. You're practically guilty already. They question your spices. The way you dry mint above the door. The way you grind seeds in the mortar. They call it alchemy. You call it dinner. But in a world that fears what it can't control, your knowledge becomes ammunition. And your kitchen becomes a laboratory for imagined sins. The church is no refuge either. You kneel in prayer and feel the eyes on your back. Not kind, not holy. Just watching, waiting. One candle sputters and they glance your way. One child coughs and someone mutters. You cross yourself slower now, not out of reverence, but as evidence. Sometimes you dream of fire, not consuming but warm, cleansing. You imagine stepping into it on your own terms, head high, hands steady, body wrapped not in shame but in defiance. Better to burn on your feet than vanish in someone else's silence. But then you wake, and the baby stirs, and reality drips back in like cold rain through a cracked roof. Your husband returns with a sour look. No hello, just silence and stale bread. You wonder if someone said something to him, if he believes it now too, or if he simply can't afford to choose between loyalty and convenience. A man with a witch wife doesn't get invited to feasts. You light a candle anyway. Stir the stew. Hum quietly to the child. You do what you've always done, survive, not because you're magic, but because you refuse to vanish. The sky outside darkens. A storm brews real this time. Thunder grumbles over the hills, and still someone will say it was you who brought it. With your silence, with your songs, with your unburnt bread. She couldn't tie her own sash yet, but they called her a bride. Her fingers were still sticky with syrup from stolen sweets, her voice still high and unsteady. But the guests clapped when she bowed her head, and the priest smiled as he handed over the contract like it was all perfectly normal. She didn't understand the words. She understood the weight of the new jewellery, though, and the way her mother wouldn't meet her eyes. You watched her walk down the aisle, a child in ceremonial silk, swimming in fabric too grand and shoes too stiff. Her groom looked old enough to be her grandfather, his beard grey, his eyes half closed like he'd already seen too many weddings. And maybe he had. Maybe she was his second, or third, or simply one more girl to add to the account books. Her dowry had been generous after all. The child bride industry wasn't hidden. It was tradition codified into law, etched into the patterns of land, livestock, and fear. In many regions, including ancient Persia, South Asia, and parts of Africa and the Middle East, girls were promised as young as 5. The wedding might wait until she reached puberty, but not always. Sometimes the ceremony happened first and her childhood ended later. Other times they overlapped. Historians still debate whether these unions were consummated immediately or delayed until physical maturity. But the fact remains these girls were not asked. They were assigned. One fringe document from medieval Yemen described a girl married at 7, moved into her husband's home at 9 and widowed by 12. She never remarried, not because she didn't want to, because no one wanted used goods. You've seen it closer than any scroll or record. The way little girls go quiet when their names are called at feast tables, the way their playmates suddenly vanish after a certain birthday, replaced by chores and headscarves and watchful eyes. They don't run through the fields anymore. They sit indoors, learning how to be obedient before they understand what it is they're obeying. The bride in your village last week, Mira, still sucks her thumb when she's nervous. You saw her do it just before the groom lifted her veil. No one laughed, no one gasped. They just smiled wider. The older women clucked about how she'd make a fine wife. Her mother cried, but only after the ceremony in the shadows, when no one could accuse her of weakness. In ancient Hindu texts, marriages between young girls and older men were described not just as acceptable, but ideal. Youth meant purity, malleability, fertility. A man could shape a young bride to his household like wet clay. And if she died young, that was unfortunate, yes, but not tragic. There would always be more girls. You remember being 10 and hearing your name mentioned over a tea? Someone from 2 villages over had inquired. You didn't even know what that meant yet. Your mother pressed her hand over yours and changed the subject, but her grip was tight, tighter than you'd ever felt before. That was the day you stopped wearing flowers in your hair. A fringe account from 19th century Ethiopia describes child brides being kept in back rooms, hidden from light until ready. Ready meant bleeding. Ready meant breasts. Or simply ready meant the day the groom grew impatient. These girls were not women, they were deadlines, and when they bled alone. No one told them what it meant, just that it was time. Time to become someone else's property. Time to carry children they couldn't yet name. Time to stop crying because tears were no longer part of the performance. You see it in their eyes, the hollowing, the way wonder turns into routine. They fold blankets with military precision. They serve stew without tasting it. Their play has been replaced by duty, and their duty is always about keeping someone else comfortable. In the Ottoman Empire, it was common for girls to be engaged before 10, especially in rural areas. Legal age didn't matter if everyone agreed to look away. One fringe court record mentions a 6-year-old bride whose father insisted her spirit was older than her body. Her husband was 39. The case was dismissed. These unions weren't just allowed, they were praised. Communities called them pious, economical, efficient, a way to link families before rivalries could take root, a way to ensure that daughters didn't fall astray. Better to hand her to a husband than risk her wandering too far with her own thoughts. You wonder what happens to those thoughts, the ones buried under layers of lace and silence. Do they escape at night? Do they whisper through the cracks in the floorboards, asking if anyone remembers their name, or do they vanish slowly like breath on winter glass? The girls don't speak much. They learn not to. Their voices are either too high, too loud, or too sharp, so they become quiet. Not submissive exactly, just resigned. Like a song hummed one note too many. You saw Mira yesterday. She was fetching water, alone. Her hands were raw, her feet blistered, but she still walked straight, chin lifted, like she was practicing being taller. You wanted to ask her if she remembered the swing behind her father's house, the one she used to fly from laughing like she was chasing birds. But her eyes said no, not because she forgot, because she couldn't afford to remember. And so the cycle turns. Another feast, another little girl in brocade, another man old enough to know better. The music plays, the food is served, and somewhere beneath all the gold and garlands a childhood is quietly buried. It's a strange thing realizing your voice holds no weight, not just in debates or decisions, but in the most private corners of your life, your body, your time, your very breath. You were told to obey, to please, to serve. Nowhere in those lessons was the word refuse. You never learned how to say no, and even if you did, it wouldn't matter, because a wife's silence is considered virtue and her consent assumed. The first time he reached for you when your skin still hurt from childbirth, you tried to pull away. Not violently, just a slight flinch. A breath caught in protest. He frowned. Not in anger, but confusion, as if rejection was a language he'd never been taught. And maybe he hadn't. Because in the world he was raised in, your discomfort is not a signal, it's a nuisance. In ancient Roman law, a husband could discipline his wife as long as he did not maim her. His rights extended not just over her dowry, but her body. A wife was expected to submit whether she wanted to or not. Historians still debate whether women ever had legal recourse for forced conjugal acts, but most agree marital rape was not a crime in the eyes of the law. One fringe document from the 13th century church even advised husbands to persist in coupling if the wife is cold for her resistance is part of Eve's curse. You remember your mother's quiet lessons, how to keep your eyes low, how to make excuses sound like apologies, how to soften refusals until they melted into obedience. Don't provoke him, she'd whisper. Let him take what he needs. That's your place. You used to think she was just being cautious. Now you understand she was passing down the only survival guide she had. The bed becomes a battlefield. Not violent, not loud, just full of quiet dread. The scent of the sheets turns sour. The shadows stretch longer. You lie there, eyes on the rafters, wondering how long it will last this time. Sometimes he speaks, sometimes he doesn't. Either way it happens. In many cultures, a woman's right to deny intimacy within marriage simply didn't exist. In ancient Hindu traditions, scriptures detailed the 5 obligations of a wife, one of which was satisfying her husband's needs at any time. In Europe, marriage was considered a conjugal debt owed by the wife as part of her sacred vow. Love had little to do with it. Duty was the only currency that mattered. One fringe tale from a 16th century Bavarian diary tells of a woman who barricaded herself in the barn to avoid her husband's nightly demands. The village called her demon-touched. Her husband had the door torn down and dragged her home by the ankle. She became pregnant soon after. No one spoke of it again. The worst part is not the act, it's the erasure. The way your needs disappear into linen, the way your no is heard as silence, your silence as permission. You stop trying to resist, not because you've accepted it, but because resistance feels like screaming into a locked room. Eventually you save your breath for things you can still change: the stew, the stitching, the story you tell yourself to sleep. He kisses your forehead afterward like a man proud of a chore completed. You roll away slowly, curling into yourself, wondering if animals feel this sort of resignation. The rooster crows before dawn, and you rise without complaint. Because that's what good wives do. They rise and sweep and bury the night under chores. In Ottoman court documents, even royal women had little say over their own bodies. Concubines and wives alike were summoned as needed, and refusal meant demotion, or worse, rumours of madness. One fringe case involves a noblewoman who allegedly faked an illness for 6 months just to avoid her husband. When he found out, he confined her to her quarters indefinitely. Her journals, if they existed, never survived. You try small rebellions, sleeping with your back turned, letting your hair stay tangled, praying a little longer before bed. But he doesn't notice, or he pretends not to, and so the ritual continues undisturbed, unasked, unloved. Sometimes you imagine saying it clearly. No, just that, loud, direct, unwavering. You picture the room freezing, his eyes widening, the candle flame sputtering like it heard something blasphemous, but it never happens, because fear is a stronger habit than hope. You heard of a woman once, Anya, who ran away after refusing her husband for weeks. They found her in the woods, bruised and barefoot, and brought her back like a runaway goat. The town whispered about her for years, not about her courage, but about her failure to submit. The shame wasn't his, it never is. There's no word for what you feel, not rage, not grief. Something quieter, something hollow and sharp. Like a well that echoes but never fills. You carry it in your hips, in your shoulders, in your sleep. In a quiet corner of history, a scroll was discovered written by an unknown woman in 11th century North Africa. In it she wrote, "I am not owned. I am not open soil. My body is not land to be tilled without asking." Scholars debated its authorship for decades. Some said it was fictional, others called it dangerous, most just ignored it. And yet you whisper it to yourself sometimes, a litany, a lullaby, a memory of what autonomy once sounded like even if you never had it. He sleeps peacefully beside you, now one hand draped over your hip. You stare into the dark, counting cracks in the ceiling wood. Tomorrow he'll expect affection. Tonight he took obedience. You gave neither, really. But in this world they're indistinguishable anyway. The dress isn't yours. It was never chosen, it was assigned. A heavy woolen thing in a dull shade of blue that marks you as respectable, obedient married. Not soft blue, not playful. No ribbon, no lace. It's the blue of the river on a winter morning, the blue of a bruise just starting to heal. You wear it every day now and it feels more like a flag than fabric. Your body has become a bulletin board for everyone else's expectations. Hair pinned back, not flowing. Sleeves to your wrists, collar to your throat. Jewellery modest, if any, except on feast days when your value is briefly displayed and then tucked away again. You once liked colour. Once braided wildflowers into your skirts. But now you dress like a wife, not a person. In many ancient and medieval societies, women's clothing functioned like social armour. In Rome, the stola marked a woman as married and respectable, distinct from a concubine's looser pallor. In ancient Greece, respectable wives wore plain garments, while hetairai courtesans donned sheer silks and vibrant dyes. Historians still debate whether these dress codes were protective or oppressive. One fringe theory suggests they were designed not to keep men honest, but to keep women quiet. Your mother-in-law inspects your hemline like it's a test. Too short, she mutters, even if it sweeps the floor. Too loose, she says, tugging at the belt you tied too gently. There's no winning, only passing. And passing means vanishing, becoming invisible in plain sight, so no one questions your virtue. You remember your wedding veil, stiff embroidered and heavy with borrowed meaning. It covered your eyes, your hair, your breath. You walked down the aisle blind, a symbol of modesty, they said. But you wonder now if it wasn't modesty they wanted, it was silence. In Ottoman courts, married women were expected to wear muted tones and head coverings that declared their household allegiance. In rural Japan, the sunokakushi, a traditional bridal headpiece, symbolized the bride's willingness to hide her horns of jealousy and pride. The message was clear: marriage meant disappearance. Not into a grave, but into fabric. The girl you were used to run barefoot in linen shifts, used to laugh in the sunskirts flying. Now even laughter must be measured. Too loud and it's improper. Too soft and it's suspicious. The right wife laughs like wind through reeds, quiet, pleasant, forgettable. There's a mirror near the stairs, and each day you pass it, a stranger walks by. Not hideous, not even unhappy. Just dressed in a way that says, I belong to someone else now. That stranger's spine is straight, her shoulders slightly curled inward. She holds a bowl or a baby or both, always busy, never wild. In medieval Europe, laws known as sumptuary codes dictated what women could wear based on their marital status and class. A widow must wear black. A wife must wear head coverings in church. A single woman could wear her hair down until the wedding, when it was braided up and never let loose again. These weren't fashion choices. They were public notices. You tried once to wear a green shawl, the one your aunt gave you embroidered with small birds. Your husband said nothing, but his mother narrowed her eyes. A bit cheerful for a married woman, isn't it, she said, folding it and placing it out of reach. The birds never flew again. One fringe tale from 18th century Bohemia tells of a woman who dyed her aprons red every spring. To feel alive, she said. After the third spring, the local priest scolded her for vanity. Her husband took the dye away. She wore grey until her death, and her funeral dress matched the walls of her cellar. The worst part is how quickly it becomes habit. You stop reaching for colour, stop checking the mirror, you button the same blouse with fingers that move automatically like winding a clock. The sameness becomes safety, or at least less dangerous than standing out. Even the way you walk changes, smaller steps, softer shoes. A wife does not stomp, a wife does not rush. You float from room to room like you're afraid of waking someone else's dream. One day you hear two girls giggling behind the bakery. There may be 14. Hair, wild skirts, hiked eyes, sharp with too much life. One is barefoot. The other wears bells on her ankles. You ache just watching them. Not with envy, but with memory. And then the widow arrives. New to the village, she wears purple, let her hair down on wash days. People call her bold. Others call her foolish. You catch her laughing, really laughing, with a mouthful of bread. And for a second you feel what freedom might look like. But then the baker's wife mutters widows can get away with anything, as if joy is a privilege reserved for the grieved. You run your fingers over the fabric of your sleeve. It's neat, sturdy, no fraying, but it doesn't feel like you. It feels like wallpaper, like the inside of a tomb someone tried to decorate. In some quiet part of your mind you keep a wardrobe no one sees. Dresses with no sleeves, colours that startle birds, hemlines that kiss your knees. You visit it sometimes at night when the house sleeps, and your body remembers softness. It's not rebellion, it's preservation. Your husband doesn't notice the difference. Why would he? You dress like a wife just as the world trained you to. He sees order. He sees tradition. He sees exactly what he's supposed to see and nothing else. The mirror waits for you tomorrow. So does the dress. So do the eyes. You'll button it again, tie the sash, smooth the sleeves. But inside a thread remains untied. A small fray, invisible but growing. And maybe someday, you'll let it unravel. They always said marriage was forever, but no one mentioned how short forever could be. Sometimes it's a decade of quiet despair. Sometimes it's a few years and 4 pregnancies later. And sometimes it's just enough time to bury your name beneath someone else's needs. You enter marriage with flowers in your hair and leave it in a shroud. You've seen it happen slowly, softly. Women disappear behind the daily routines, chopping, scrubbing, mending, nursing. They shrink from full-bodied laughter to polite smiles, from singing while kneading dough to whispering hymns beneath their breath. Then one day someone says she never looked well. As if marriage is a kind of slow fever, and no one noticed the sweating until the shaking began. In ancient medical texts, wives were described as weaker vessels, particularly vulnerable to illness from emotional imbalance and reproductive strain. That's one way to describe childbirth without painkillers, rest, or nutrition. One fringe physician in 12th century France even claimed that melancholy in women was caused by unconsummated desire or too much spinning, as if the cure for grief was more obedience, as if domestic labour was the prescription and the disease all at once. Your neighbour died last winter. She was 33. The official cause was wasting illness, though everyone knew it was the third miscarriage in 2 years. The sleepless nights the husband's belt, the silence she held like a stone in her stomach. No funeral songs, just a quick burial and quicker remarriage of her husband 3 weeks later to a younger cousin. The stew was still warm on her windowsill. Marriage is supposed to offer protection, but too often it offers exposure, especially to violence that isn't loud enough to be noticed. In many cultures, a wife was considered property, and what a man does with his property is his own affair. Laws were few, witnesses rarer, compassion conditional. Historians still argue whether domestic abuse was officially sanctioned or simply ignored. Either way, women bore the bruises behind kitchen doors and called them falling down the stairs. In Renaissance Florence, a woman who ran to her mother's home after her husband broke her ribs was forced to return. The city records list it as reconciliation. Her neighbours remember it as the day she stopped talking. Even without violence, marriage could kill. Through childbirth, through starvation, through exhaustion. You know a girl who married into a house with 8 sons and was expected to feed them all while pregnant twice in 3 years. She collapsed one morning carrying water. They say she just didn't eat enough. They don't say why. In medieval Europe, maternal mortality was a silent epidemic. Some estimates suggest as many as 1 in 4 women died due to complications from pregnancy or labour. No antiseptic, no understanding of infection, just hope, and maybe a midwife who'd seen worse. You weren't told these numbers before the wedding. They would have ruined the feast. Your mother lost 2 sisters before they turned 25. One to fever after birth. The other bled out in a room full of prayers but no cloth. You remember her hands calloused but gentle. She made the best bean stew in the village. After she died, the priest said she was a dutiful wife, as if that summed her up. One fringe case in 18th century Persia describes a woman who died in her sleep after years of chronic pain and untreated illness. Her husband recorded it in his ledger, household loss, year 17 wife expired. No mention of her name, just a subtraction. Some women died in parts over time, not physically, not all at once, but in spirit. Their laughter dimmed, their spines curved, their letters, if they were lucky enough to write, turned from poems to shopping lists. You've met women like that. You might become one. You already feel the soft hollowness creeping in. There are days you forget your own birthday, days you eat standing, sleep sitting. Wake up before the sun and ask yourself who that tired face belongs to. Your hands always smell of broth. Your feet throb from the cold. You count time in batches of bread and cycles of the moon. And somewhere inside, you know this is a slow, dying, sanctioned and sanctified. One woman in your aunt's village refused to eat after her wedding. She simply stopped. No protest, no crying. Just silence and smaller portions. Her body faded like mist. Her family called it sickness of the heart. The priest blamed bad blood. The truth was simpler. She just couldn't find the will to stay. They say a good wife gives everything. But what happens when everything isn't enough? When the giving empties you beyond return? You've seen eyes like that, flat, distant, resigned. Not sad, not angry. Just finished. Even widowhood doesn't always bring relief. In many traditions, widows were expected to continue mourning for years, wearing black, avoiding joy, sleeping alone. In some parts of India, sati forced widows to die on their husbands' funeral pyres. A fringe tale tells of a widow who ran from the flames only to be dragged back by her own cousins. They called it honour. She called it smoke. And yet despite it all, some women endure. They find corners to hide laughter songs, to hum under their breath herbs that soothe and secrets that soften. You cling to those stories like a lifeline. Not because they promise escape, but because they prove that even in the dying, something can still survive. You close your eyes tonight wondering which part of you vanished this week. Was it the girl who loved dancing, the woman who loved storms, or just another sliver of the person you used to be before marriage became a slow erosion? You whisper to yourself, not a prayer, not a wish, just a name, your own, to remember you're still here. It sits on the shelf beside the prayer book, and the recipe scrolls worn at the edges, smelling faintly of pressed flowers and old leather. The Good Wife Manual. Not officially titled, of course, but everyone knows what it is. A collection of rules disguised as wisdom of obedience dressed in lace. Passed down from mother to daughter, neighbour to bride, often without question, because questioning is not part of the curriculum. You opened it once. Just once. The ink was faded, but the expectations weren't. Rise before your husband, warm his slippers, speak only when spoken to. A wife who nags drives away blessings. Keep your face pleasant, your words sweeter than broth. You closed it after the 10th page stomach twisting. Not because of what it said, but because of how familiar it already felt. These manuals weren't fiction. They existed across centuries and continents, tailored to culture and class, but always sharing the same spine. In medieval Europe, Le Ménager de Paris instructed wives on how to endure a husband's temper and clean his clothes with humility. In Ming China, Nujie lessons for women taught girls that the sky was male, the earth female, and thus obedience was cosmic law. Historians still debate whether these texts were tools of oppression or survival guides for navigating a system stacked against them. But even survival, when written in rules, can feel like a cage. You remember your own version, spoken not written. From your mother, your aunt, your neighbour with the long sighs. Don't raise your voice, never finish his sentence. Serve his guests before you sit. Swallow your pride with your porridge. It wasn't said cruelly. It was said with love, as if love could make it easier to disappear. The rules are relentless. A good wife doesn't argue even when she's right. A good wife doesn't complain even when she's bleeding. A good wife doesn't cry in front of the children even when her heart is falling apart. You begin to measure yourself not in joy or meaning, but in how few mistakes you can make in a day. A clean corner, a quiet evening, a satisfied husband. That's the scorecard now. You hear of one woman martyr who burned the manual, tossed it in the hearth after her 3rd child was born. They called her wild, difficult, cursed. Her husband beat her less after that, though. Maybe because he was afraid of what else she'd burn. Maybe because he knew she'd stopped playing the game. A fringe copy of a 17th century Polish marriage guide lists 103 traits of an ideal wife. Among them, knows when to be silent during supper, sings sweetly but not often, and has cheerful eyes even in illness. It reads like a playbook for polite invisibility, like a recipe for losing yourself with a ribbon tied around it. You try to follow the rules. You do. You keep the hearth lit. You warm the bed. You listen more than you speak. But some days your face refuses to soften. Some days your silence comes out sharp, and you wonder quietly what chapter that breaks. There's a section in the manual on forgiveness. How to forget insults quickly. How to interpret criticism as love. How to understand that a raised voice is just a man's burden leaking out. You read that part twice. Once with your lips, once with your fists clenched beneath the table. Even the way you move becomes subject to the code. Kneel gently, pour steadily, smile before turning your back. If you drop something, pick it up with grace. If you slip, laugh lightly, as if your clumsiness is charming and not from fatigue. You become choreography with no music, always performing, always rehearsing. Some say these rules are meant to protect, that a well-trained wife keeps the household peaceful, that avoiding conflict is a kind of cleverness. But peace bought with silence is just war postponed. You feel the tension beneath the table, in the corners of his mouth, in the slam of the door when the stew is slightly cold. In certain Islamic teachings, manuals advised women to perfume their breath, and never speak ill of their husband's guests, even if those guests insulted her. In Victorian England, etiquette books warned against reading novels as they could inflame the female imagination. A fringe American text from the 1800s instructed wives to always greet their husband with a smile no matter the hour, even if that hour was bruised, even if that smile cracked. You once tried to follow everything for a full week, woke before dawn, folded linens precisely, bit your tongue so often you tasted blood. At the end of the week, your husband said, "You've been quiet lately. It's nice." And somehow that felt worse than all the silence that came before it. There's no manual for grief, for watching yourself fade while everyone else applauds your restraint, for losing your laughter and being praised for your composure, for waking up in a life that looks perfect on parchment, but feels like drowning in honey-sweet slow and impossible to scream through. Sometimes you catch your reflection, just a flicker in the kettle or the window glass. A woman dressed correctly, standing correctly, smiling politely, but her eyes are elsewhere, maybe in a memory, maybe in a future without a manual, maybe just somewhere she doesn't have to ask permission to breathe. You imagine writing your own version, one page, one rule. Be as you're not as you're told. You know it wouldn't be accepted. They'd call it selfish. They'd call it dangerous. But it would be true. And truth even whispered can be the start of rebellion. For now you fold the apron, smooth the blanket, turn the page in your mind. Another chapter of shoulds and musts. Another day of almosts. But the thread of doubt is growing thicker. And maybe one day that thread will become a rope, and that rope might pull you out. They were whispered about more than spoken of, these women, the ones who said no, who walked away from the altar or never approached it at all, who traded veils for cloak silk, for soil husbands for solitude. They weren't saints. They weren't rebels in shining armour. They were just tired of playing a game that always ended with their silence. You heard of one Lena who fled the night before her wedding, left a note tucked inside her bridal slippers: "I would rather walk barefoot than wear a life not mine." They searched for her for days, found her tending goats in the hills 2 months later, cheeks sunburnt and eyes brighter than they'd ever been in the village. Her father refused to speak to her again. Her mother sent her dried fruit every winter wordlessly. In medieval Europe, some women sought refuge in convents, not always out of faith, but out of desperation. A nun's life was strict, yes, but it offered something marriage did in a locked door you could bolt from the inside. Historians still debate whether convents were sanctuaries or prisons in disguise. A fringe letter from a 14th century abbess describes her sisters as quietly defiant, claiming they sang louder during prayers when the bishop visited to drown out the silence forced on them elsewhere. Others escaped not through cloisters but forests. Woods became havens for the unwed, the unmarriable, the unyielding. Women with bruised hearts and calloused hands building small homes from branches and willpower. They gathered herbs, whispered songs, taught one another how to make things grow. The villagers called them witches, but only because free woman was too unsettling a phrase. You've seen the way people look at the unmarried past a certain age, like milk left too long on the shelf. Never mind if she's clever, kind, skilled. If she has no ring, she must have no value. Or worse, she must have opinions, and there's no room for that at most dinner tables. In ancient Rome, the Vestal virgins held rare power. Freed from marriage, they served the goddess Vesta, kept the sacred flame burning, and could even own property. But one misstep, one whisper of unchastity, and they were buried alive. The message was clear. Freedom for women comes with a cost, often steep, sometimes fatal. One fringe account from 17th century Morocco tells of a woman who lived alone by the river selling ink and paper. They said she wrote letters for wives who couldn't read, and prayers for husbands who never prayed. No one knew her real name. She signed her pages with a single symbol, a ring broken open. Not all women who refused the ring ran. Some stayed right where they were and simply declined. Politely, firmly, over and over again. You admire them most. Because they didn't have to disappear to survive, they stood still and made the world walk around them. There's a story about a merchant's daughter Nerissa who turned down 13 proposals. Her father gave up after the 8th. The town gave up after the 11th. By the 13th she had a small bookshop and an enormous cat, and no one asked any more. They said she'd gone odd. But her shelves were always full and her eyes never looked tired. You wonder what that kind of freedom tastes like. To dress how you like, sleep when you want, speak without glancing sideways first. There's a myth that unmarried women are lonely, but sometimes it seems they're the only ones who aren't waiting for permission to exhale. Still, it wasn't always safe. In many villages, a woman without a man was a threat, a puzzle that couldn't be controlled. She must be cursed, or bitter, or secretly full of desire she could never satisfy. People pointed fingers, spread stories, not because she was wrong, but because she was free. You once saw a girl at market who wore no ring, no scarf, no apology. She laughed too loudly, ate without daintiness. She stood taller than the men beside her and didn't shrink when they stared. You watched her buy cherries and eat them one by one, juice on her fingers like she didn't owe anyone cleanliness. And you thought that looks like peace. In the archives of forgotten letters, there's one from a woman named Elsbeth to her sister, dated 1661. I have no husband and no want for one. My bread is plain, my bed quiet, and my time entirely mine. Scholars dismiss it as unusual, but you read it like scripture. Sometimes women weren't given the choice to refuse. They were simply overlooked, too plain, too clever, too poor. And what was meant as punishment became sanctuary. They learned to make their own way, knit their own stories. Some never married because no one asked. Some never married because they asked themselves first and answered no. A fringe tale from rural Russia tells of a woman who wore a wedding dress to the river every year alone. To marry the water, she said. It listens better. The villagers laughed. But no one dared disturb her ritual. She died old, toothless, and smiling, her veil still folded in the drawer. You wonder what kind of woman you'd be if you'd refused. If you'd stepped sideways at the altar, turned the ring into a coin, tossed it into a fountain, and walked away. Maybe you'd be hungrier, lonelier, maybe not. Maybe you'd be humming in the forest with calloused hands and a name no one mispronounced. The world doesn't offer many paths for women who say no, but still they carve them, in ink and footsteps, in seeds planted on unclaimed hillsides. Some pay dearly, others just quietly vanish into stories like wind in trees, unnamed, unowned, unafraid. You fold the laundry, now staring out the window. A girl walks by with no scarf on her head. She's not married yet, but her stride says she might never be. You almost smile, because somewhere inside there's still a version of you that remembers what it feels like to choose. They bent her spine, but not her will. They silenced her voice, but not her thoughts. They wrote her story without asking her name, and yet she endured. Not always proudly, not always loudly, but with a quiet resilience that turned survival into a kind of rebellion. A whispered resistance passed down like a recipe with no measurements, just instinct. She learned to stretch one breath into a song, to fold grief into bread dough, to lace silence with meaning. She found power in the small things, spooning warmth into bowls, keeping the hearth lit when her own flame dimmed. When the world denied her choice, she made rituals of the things left to her. She named the chickens after stars. She sang lullabies that were half prayers, half protest. They told her love was duty. She found it in stolen moments with her child instead. History rarely remembers women like her. Not the queens or the martyrs, but the ones who stayed, who stitched the wounds of others while nursing invisible ones of their own, who buried sisters and washed sheets and kept going. One fringe chronicle from rural Wales describes a woman who never missed a meal, a prayer, or a child's question. She was never named, just the wife of Owain. But her life kept a whole house from falling apart. In the corners of convents, behind market stalls, beside cold cradles, she existed. endured, adapted. She learned to read between the lines of religious texts that called her lesser, found loopholes in commandments meant to contain her, not to break them, but to breathe within them, to be the wind passing through the cracks in the stone. She wasn't always kind. Sometimes she snapped. Sometimes she went still for days, hiding her hurt behind chores done too slowly. She broke plates once, cut her own hair in the dark. But the next morning she rose again, with tired hands, with heavy feet, with that same stubborn fire low in her chest. They said she was made for obedience, but she redefined what obedience meant. She obeyed her own need to protect, to nurture, to remain. They told her to bow. She bent, but never in the way they meant. She bowed to her children's needs, to the rhythm of the seasons, to the parts of herself no law could touch. Even when the blood came too soon or not at all, even when the man beside her grew cruel or cold or simply absent, even when the church called her sinful and the village called her strange, she endured, because endurance was its own language, one she spoke fluently. One fringe diary found in a monastery attic describes a woman who carved birds into the beams above her bed, to remind myself that something still flies. No signature, no ending, just that single line. And somehow that was enough. She hid poems between mattress seams, dried flowers inside recipe books, taught her daughters how to say yes with their eyes and no with their silence. She braided warnings into lullabies, left truths behind in her stitching, not for recognition, but for remembrance. When the midwife came, she helped without flinching. When the neighbour cried, she listened without judgment. When the child next door ran away, she packed food in a hidden pouch. No one wrote those acts down, but they were real. They were the quiet kind of heroism, the kind that never asks for applause. They tried to define her by what she lacked. No land, no vote, no name on the deed. But they forgot what she had: hands that knew how to heal a back that carried more than it should, a memory like a woven net of everything that came before her. She was not just one woman. She was the sum of many. In her own way she changed history, not in battlefields or courtrooms, but in kitchens and birthing rooms and lonely fields. She turned bitterness into survival, turned silence into legacy. And when she could give no more, she still gave warmth. The stories didn't always end well, but they ended with her still here, holding a child, tending a fire, walking to the well. She lived long enough to outlast the rules, to see her granddaughter walk alone to school, to see someone ask a wife what she wanted for supper. She didn't call it victory, she called it a good day. And you lying here now listening in the dark are part of that survival, whether you wear a ring or not, whether you choose to stay or go, whether you whisper or roar. That thread she carried, you carry it too. So take a breath, a long one. Let it settle into your chest like a soft stone in a deep lake. Now the fire has burned low. The storm has passed outside the windows, if there ever was one, and the house is quiet again. Your eyes are heavier than they were an hour ago. The weight of these stories, of their stillness, their truth, their ache, rests gently now like a thick blanket across your chest. You don't need to remember every name, every century, every rule. The memory is in the rhythm, in the silence between breaths. Let go of the roles they gave you. Let go of the folded linens and the tightened corsets and the quiet dinners where you chewed your thoughts instead of your food. There's nothing to prove right now, nothing to tidy, no lace to adjust, no posture to perfect. You don't have to wear anything but the truth that you're still here, still breathing, still soft in the places they tried to harden. Feel the bed beneath you, how still it is, how forgiving. The kind of stillness you've earned, the kind that belongs to you and you alone. Your breath, your limbs, your thoughts untangled for once. Let them rest, let them drift. The women who came before you lived through silence and shadow, but they left light behind, just enough to see your own shape in the dark. Not a perfect shape, not a fixed one, but yours. So when you close your eyes tonight, do it softly. Do it like a secret. Do it like someone who knows she's more than survival. You are sleep well, quiet one, and dream not of what you were told to be, but of everything you still are becoming.